Well, first of all, I really appreciate you from all the Convention of the States people here in Kansas. Appreciate you being here tonight. If you picked up any of the materials or you know what Convention of the States is about, we all have a problem with the current system. We see the degrade of our country, and no able-bodied citizen wants to see that. And that's why I'm here. That's why I believe many of us are here. And that's why I started off with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's because what he said is so true, and that's the whole reason of why we're here, why I'm here. In 2007, Brian Sheets, a specialist in the Pennsylvania National Guard, suffered an injury in Afghanistan. He came back, he spent over a year in the VA hospital with extensive grenade damage. After he got out, he said these words. He said, "I marvel that I returned home to a country where you can walk the dog without being worried about sniper fire or IEDs. We've got it made in this country. You walk into the grocery store, you have choices, whereas just waking up over there is a blessing. The United States might not be perfect, but I'll take her any day." And you know what? He's so right. He's so right. We've got an opportunity. We've got this amazing blessing, this opportunity to be Americans. And it's my goal that we extend that opportunity to all future generations, not only for us, but as the Constitution says, to preserve the liberty for ourselves and our posterity. And that's why we're here this evening. So what am I going to talk about tonight? First, I'd like to talk about Convention of States, explaining the idea, the nuts and bolts of the convention, what happens in a convention, some of the specificities of how a Convention of States happens. But then second, I want to go into the founding principles. And this just helps us understand why Convention of the States is the answer, why the Founding Fathers put it in there in the first place, and why it's so important that we should be interested. And then finally, just a brief mention of what we have today, and then a summary of that. So what is Article 5 of the Constitution? There are two methods for proposing amendments. The first one is through Congress, and we've used this 27 times. The first 10 were the Bill of Rights, and the next 17 have been progressively over the years. We've had to amend the Constitution. We're all familiar with this. So 2/3 of Congress proposes an amendment, and then it's ratified by 3/4 of the states. 3/4 of 50 is 38. Now there's a second method that's much less known about, and that's the Convention of States method. Now the only thing that differs with this second method from the first method is that a Convention of States proposes the amendments. All right, and we see that by when we have the convention will be called by 2/3 of the states, so that's 34 of the states will call a convention, will pass an application, and then we'll go through and they'll propose their amendments, and then they'll be ratified in the same manner as the first, with 3/4 majority of the states in 38. So specifically, what does Article 5 say? The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. I'll stop right here. The convention doesn't change the Constitution. The convention doesn't amend the Constitution. They simply propose amendments. And like we already saw, it goes back to the 38 states that have to ratify those individual amendments. So finishing the paragraph here, which in either case shall be valid in all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states or by conventions in the states. So that translates over into this right here. 34 states submit an application for a convention. So far we have 12. The most recent, I believe, was in Missouri or South Dakota. 12 so far have passed an application. All right, once we call that application, they get together, commissioners debate, propose, and vote upon possible amendments. In the convention, it's one state, one vote. Number 4, individual proposed amendments are then sent for ratification to the several states. Those are individually. And if some of the states want to, let's say they have 5 proposed amendments coming out of the Constitution, any individual state can ratify 3 and not the other 2. It's completely, entirely up to the state legislatures to ratify these amendments. And that is the process of Article 5. Now, a few more of the specifics. In order to call a convention here in the state of Kansas, it's a little different than several others. It takes a 3/4 majority in both houses. So, 2/3 majority. Thank you. I need my correction here. 2/3 majority in both houses. And that's different from a few of the other states where it just takes a simple majority. 2 years ago was the closest we ever got. And we missed it by about 10 votes in the House of Representatives. but otherwise we're doing fairly well. Once those 34 states call the convention, then the states have to decide how they're going to select their delegates to this convention. And that totally depends on the individual states. They have full freedom to decide how they want to send those delegates to the convention. Now that's about the entire process, and if there are any other questions, just go ahead and save those to the end, and we'll answer those for you. So moving on to this next part, this is the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and this starts the idea of principles and founding principles. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that when any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, those ends stated above, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. If you have a business, if you have a church, if you have anything that's structured as an organization, there are principles which guide that organization. And if you have a succeeding business over here, there's a reason that it's succeeding. And likewise, if there's a business that's failing, there's a reason for that. And that reason is based on those principles, and the same thing goes for nations. A prosperous nation has good principles, and a non-prospering nation has poor principles. And so the principles that America was founded upon is what's led to our prosperity. So what are those principles? The first one I want to talk about is sovereignty of the people. The second is sovereignty of the states. And finally, I want to go over a history of the convention. So starting right off with that first one, sovereignty of the people. Representative government. Now the first governmental document ever created on the North American continent was the Mayflower Compact. And in this Mayflower Compact, a government was created that was a representative government. The government was responsible to the people, and the people were involved in the government. The next one that occurred was the first Constitution of the North American continent, and that was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And likewise, it was a representative form of government. The people were involved in the government. Now this succeeded in all succeeding 13 colonies up to 1776. All of them had a representative form of government. Now they had a lower house and a higher house, and the higher house was controlled by Parliament and by the King of Great Britain. But the lower house was controlled by the individual states. Now this lower house held the purse strings. In all 13 states, the lower house held the purse strings. Now why is this important? Because whenever you control the flow of money, you control a lot more power than the other branch. And that's exactly what happened. So the primary interest of these 13 colonies and the first 150 years of our nation was a representative form of government. A government where the people were involved and the people were the leaders of the government, and the government was responsible to the people. To summarize all of that, our first founding was founded upon self-government. Now, William Blackstone's commentaries on law comprise the second aspect of sovereignty of the people. He wrote these in the mid-1700s, 3 volumes, and they described common law. Common law meant that something that Parliament wasn't always involved in, but that were natural to you. And that's what he called these, the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now this phrase right here not only appears in many of the original colonies' constitutions, but also appears in the Declaration of Independence. And that signifies the right to life. Right? In the Declaration it says liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and property. Those are those laws of nature and of nature's God. And when there's a void of government, the common law is what's determined. All right? And this was summarized by William Blackstone in his commentaries. Now, his commentaries were well read by all of the Founding Fathers and comprised many of the pillars of our Constitution and of our Declaration. These ideas of the laws of nature and of nature's God were fundamental in the establishing of our government. So I want to ask this question to finish up our discussion on sovereignty of the people. Where do our rights come from? Do they come from the government? Do they come from us? Where do our rights come from? God. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that God gives us the unalienable rights. Those laws of nature and nature's God, that's where we get our rights. No government gives you rights. All right? Now, an oppressive government would take away your rights and would put their place in the place of God and would try to give you your rights, but that's not natural. Right? It's the laws of nature and the nature's God. That's where we get our rights. And that's the fundamental principle of the American founding. So sovereignty of the states, what's this one about? At what time did we have a federal government? And the only time we ever had a federal government was post-Constitution. As soon as the Constitution was ratified and we implemented a Congress under the Constitution, that's the first time we ever had a federal government. So what kind of government do we have previous to that? And for the first 150 years of our country, it was first governed by the cities, it was then governed by the counties, and it was then governed by the states. And the state was the final authority in your area. There was no federal government. And that brings me to the second one. The individual colonies were individual states. And this is said perfectly in the Declaration of Independence. This is one of the subsequent paragraphs. They say, these united colonies are of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is not to be totally dissolved. The thing to note here is state and state. The individual colonies, Georgia, New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, they were equivalent to the state of Great Britain. All right, I forget the name of it, the Paris Agreement, the Paris Treaty that ended the Revolutionary War. King George signed a peace treaty with 13 colonies. He didn't sign it with one America. And in the Paris Treaty, I believe is the name of what it is, it lists the 13 colonies and says we are now at peace with those colonies. Our sovereignty of the states. It's fundamental, and we have a tendency, I know I have a tendency to forget that now, when we think of the federal government. Or you think of the government of the United States, you always think of Washington, D.C. Well, that's not the case. Even under the Constitution, as we'll get to see here in just a moment, under the Constitution, the state governments had more power than the federal government. The federal government doesn't exist without the state governments. Sovereignty of the states is another one of those central principles in our founding. So history of convention. How many times have we gotten together in a convention-like group as states? The first one that I recall in my history books is the Stamp Act. This was in 1765. The Stamp Act had just been passed. And the states got together and they said, what are we going to do about this? We've got to talk about this. So they got together in a convention and they wrote the resolves of that convention. The next one is intercontinental committees. This was started by Samuel Adams. He wrote letters between the governors of all of the different states, and he said, here's what we need to do, here's what you need to do, how can we work this together? States are working together. The next one is the First and Second Continental Congresses. Obviously, the second one produced our Declaration of Independence, but again, this is just a convention of states that were getting together, working on things. Since they were individual states, individual countries, they decided to get together and work on these things. The next one is the Mount Vernon Convention. This one was the one right previous to the Annapolis Convention and the Constitutional Convention. And this one was specifically drawn together to determine land disputes. Several of the states were having trouble deciding where their border was, and they couldn't figure it out. And the Congress under the Articles of Confederation couldn't figure it out either. And so they got together and they said, how are we going to work this out? And only one state actually showed up to that convention. So it was kind of a blow-off. It didn't work out. So they called the Annapolis Convention, and they said, how can we fix this out? And actually, for the Annapolis Convention, all 13 colonies were invited. Only 5 showed up. And they still couldn't figure anything binding out because not everyone was there. And so at the very end of the convention, James Madison said, we can't let this go to waste. So next summer in Philadelphia, let's call a convention to revise the Articles. And that's what we know today as the Constitutional Convention. All of these so far were simply states, separate countries, individual countries, sovereign states get together and talking things out. The final one I want to mention is the Bill of Rights Convention. Now the states never actually got together, but right after the Constitution was ratified, it was only ratified in several of the states with the promise that a Bill of Rights would be added to it. And so in Virginia, Congress wasn't working on the Bill of Rights fast enough. And so Virginia said, nope, we're going to call a convention of states under Article 5. And that's in fact where we get the name Convention of States. Virginia coined that term. They said, we're going to call it an Article 5 Convention of States, and we're going to get ourselves a Bill of Rights, and then we'll submit it to you, Congress. Well, Congress got the word, and James Madison introduced the 12 amendments, which were then 10, and we got a Bill of Rights. But I just wanted to mention that because that's where we get the name Convention of States specifically. So, founders' intents. What's the government that we got? Limited 3-branch federal government. All of their powers to the states. The 9th and 10th Amendments state this specifically. All of their powers not herein granted or prohibited by the Constitution are granted to the states. This is a specific wording of the 10th Amendment. When the people fear the government, there is security. And when the government fears the people, there's liberty. That's the summation of our federal government. That's the summation of the ideas behind the reason we created the federal government and the reason that we have state governments which control the federal government. And finally, the most important principle is self-government. So those are the founding principles. And that's what we're talking about. So what do we have now? Unconstitutional lawmaking, overregulation, spending, and debt. I don't have to spend much time on this because we all experience this every day. This is why we're here. I want to put this one in here because this explained so much for me when I first heard this. Thomas Jefferson was asked by the French government in the 1800s, they asked him, how can we succeed like you succeeded? What principle did you have? What do we need to do to be like the United States of America? And he wrote several letters. This one appeared in his second letter, and he was talking about the judiciary system. And he said this: it should be remembered as an axiom of eternal truth in politics, that whenever any form of government or any power of government is independent, it's absolute also. And you look at history, you look at our government, you look at any government in history, and it's so true. Whenever they're independent from the people, they're not responsible to the people, they're absolute also. And that's what we see today. I put in this little graph here, I call it the mountain graph. This starts, the small little step down there starts in 1976. And this one up here is in 2009. This is the number of regulations created by the federal government in the past 40 years. Right now we're sitting at somewhere around 170,000 rules. If you take a look at the United States Code, it's 364 volumes, it takes up 50 feet of shelf space. We've got all these rules. The federal government was never supposed to have these rules. Like we already talked about, the state governments were over the federal government. The federal government only determined a few of the disputes between the states and some of the foreign relations. That's pretty much the extent of the federal government. They're never supposed to worry about 170,000 rules and laws. All right, overregulation. You see this in every aspect. The presidency, the Congress, and especially the judicial branch. They're completely out of control. They've escaped the box which they were put in. And our principles have been violated. And the success of those principles has been compromised. All right, we've gone away from those principles that we were founded upon. And we're seeing some of the problems we have here today. So that's that, but what is the root of the problem? The people have neglected their responsibility. And this has happened in every government across history. You look at history, and that's what I've been doing this past semester and taking a political philosophy class. You look at any society, any government in history, it's natural for the people to neglect their responsibility. You know, I'm here, I'm just going to enjoy what my dad made for me, and I'm not going to work any farther on giving that to my next generation. It's the natural inclination of human beings to do. So we've neglected our responsibility, and in that void, the governments replace that. And that's the root of the problem. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but the test of man's character give him power. This is one of my favorite Abraham Lincoln quotes, and I put it on here because I don't think the guys in Washington, D.C., our representatives in Washington, D.C., are these terrible, evil men. I don't think that. They have certain principles which are guiding their actions, and they have certain processes for how they make their decisions. And if I was in that very place, if I was in their very place and I had the same principles and the same process for decision, I'd make the same exact decisions. And so the point here is that it's human nature to do what's going on currently. And it's not because they're evil men, it's because they're using principles that determine their decisions. I just thought I'd mention that here. So what's the solution to the problem? The people have to reclaim our responsibility. It's rightfully ours. It's part of our being as Americans. Those principles that we talked about. Self-government, especially there at the bottom. Those principles. And then the American. Why did I put that word there on the bottom? What was America called as soon as the Constitution was ratified and we first had our government? What did several of the other nations call the United States? And what did the Founding Fathers call themselves? They called themselves the Great American Experiment. It's the Great American Experiment. Never been tried before. No government in history had these principles that had been constructed in this manner. It was the Great American Experiment. At what time did we stop being an experiment? It's my contention that we've never stopped being an experiment. We've only forgotten we were an experiment because we've succeeded like on any other government in history. We're still the American experiment. We're still the American experiment. And with that knowledge, we take those principles that we were founded upon, which we got a glimpse of tonight. We take those principles and reinstate them, and that's what Convention of States is all about. Convention of States is one of the remedies provided by the Founding Fathers to our Constitution, to our government, It's one of those aspects that allows us to return to our principles. We're still the great American experiment, and we can still return to those principles. So going back to that process, just to make sure that's fresh in our minds, and if you had any questions, we can go back to those. 34 states, Congress calls the convention, commissioners debate and propose, one state, one vote. Proposed amendments are then sent for the states for ratification, and 38 states must ratify each of those individual amendments in order for it to become part of the Constitution. I'll close up with this one. This was stated in George Washington by his farewell address. Mr. President said this: "If in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers is in any particular wrong, let it be changed by an amendment, corrected by an amendment in the way in which the Constitution specifies." It's right in there. It's in the Constitution. It's the ability for us to shift our country back to those principles. And like Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, the greatest test of any society is the type of world that it leaves to its children. That's why I do it. Right? I'm a high school student. And I love the idea that I have the power, I have the ability to shift my nation. And that's what Convention of the States is about. It's about a lot of things, as I've already said. But it's the ability for me to get involved in my community and have an impact. So that's why I do Convention of the States. Finally, how can you get involved? Join our team by signing up on the website. If you haven't signed the petition yet, it's right on there. Sign on to conventionofstates.com and it'll be right there. It'll be one of the first links there on the page. Sign the petition, talk to your representatives. Really appreciate the representatives who showed up tonight. Convention of States, that's what it's about, is talking to your representatives, educate your circles, and if you feel it in your heart, please donate. Money is always very helpful in this cause. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and if there are any questions, go ahead and we'll have David Snyder come up here, and we'll answer any of those that we have for you. But thank you so much for being here tonight.